All right, the meat is in the sections 2 through 8 of the proposal. This is like about a 90-page document of the proposed new rule. Ensure that the risk-based protections are adequate and sensitive to the actual risk. Streamline the IRB review process. Improve informed consent. Strengthen data protections to minimize informational risks. Data collection to enhance the system oversight. Extend the federal regulations, as I said, to unfunded research, that is non-federally funded research, and clarify and harmonize requirements and agency guidance. Proposals are presented. These are only proposals. They are very interested in comments from private citizens, from groups, from IRBs, from institutions. They will read all of them, they will post all of them, and they will consider them in revising the proposed rules. There are 74 questions broken out into subsections on each of the proposed changes, and they have very specific concrete content that they would like to see people provide, either as examples or particular concerns that they have. And they're very generous in saying, and by the way, you don't have to respond just to these proposed new rules. You got anything else you want to say about the way the federal government runs, feel free to weigh in. Ensuring risk-based protections, 5 potential refinements. The goal is, of course, to ensure that the protections are commensurate with the level of risk. The refinements. They want to establish mandatory data security and information protection standards that would be applied to anybody doing any research involving human subjects. One set of data security standards. Revise the rules for continuing review, revise the regulations about expedited review, revise the rules for exempt studies, and require consent for biospecimens. So these are pretty far-reaching suggestions. A new mechanism for protecting subjects from informational risk and calibrating the levels of risk to the levels of review to the level of risk. Next slide. Here's their view. If we were to standardize data protections rather than rely on IRB review, that might be a more effective way to minimize informational risks. What they want to do is to say, complying with HIPAA for data security right now is only the responsibility of covered entities. Typically, those are entities that provide health care or provide payment for health care or provide billing services for health care. And the HIPAA privacy rule only applies to those covered entities. Grand Valley is not a covered entity. We're not required to be compliant with the HIPAA, with the exception of our counseling center and our health center. The rest of the university is not bothered by HIPAA standards. And if anybody who's ever dealt with HIPAA standards, any of you have familiarity with HIPAA? This proposal is HIPAA standards apply to all human subjects research. Now, the amazing thing about that suggestion is they think that's going to solve the problem of informational risk. They are so sure that that's going to solve the problem of informational risk, they're now going to say IRBs never need to consider informational risk in reviewing a protocol. Because your institution is compliant with the data standards as required under HIPAA. So that's one of their proposals. Next slide.
Having worked with about 3 different healthcare environments, there are such a wide variation of HIPAA interpretation and practices and internal regulations. It's totally local.
It can be, and when you've got standards or you've got room for interpretation, of course you're going to get variability of that. And what they're proposing is, well, we'll adopt the HIPAA standards, but if they need clarification and tweaking, maybe we could do that at the same time. But this is their, one fix fixes all. Namely, once you adopt HIPAA standards to all the research data, everybody's protected, at least from informational risk. Okay, next section. The IRB would not be responsible any longer for assessing the adequacy of the study's procedures for protecting against informational risk. Why? Well, because you've already got institutional requirements. So the IRB doesn't need to revisit those and say, are you being compliant with the requirements you're supposed to be compliant with? So that's a waste of time. Don't ask them that question. They're supposed to do it. The risk assessment for determining the level of review would not include consideration of informational risk. So, let's imagine that you want to do in criminal justice some interviews with some people about criminal behavior. You're just trying to get, how criminally active is the general population. So you're going to do some surveys, some focus groups, and that sort of stuff. And you're not sure what kind of information you're going to get, but you're suspicious that maybe down the road you're going to want to come back and revisit some of those people. So you collect their names, you collect their contact information, and you also have their answers to the survey, right? How should that data set? My name is Paul Reidemeyer, and I was guilty of but never convicted of a felony in 1972 involving, pick the crime of your choice, recreational drugs. And here's what I have to say about that experience. Very interesting information, very valuable research data for a legitimate researcher to collect and analyze and write some earth-shattering report as a result of. But what speaks to the data security of that information? Because if that fell into the wrong hands, or that was maliciously used, posted on the internet, that sort of a thing, there could be huge repercussions to the people who participated in that research. The IRB would not be allowed to consider any of those risks, would not be allowed to consider any of those security precautions in its review and approval of that proposed research, because that researcher is supposed to be compliant with HIPAA data security standards. And so you just presume they all know what those are, how to be compliant with them, and are compliant with them, even with nobody checking. That's the proposal. All right, next